So before we get to the painting portion, I wanted to just make a separate video to talk about how the mirroring needs to be set up. And this is something that confuses people quite a bit, and so I thought I would just run over it. So if you're going to have pieces that are split, down the middle and mirrored across an axis, and the geometry that connects those two pieces, that center edge line is not flat, like completely flat, then you need to mirror in a specific way. And by that I mean you need to offset the mirrored portions 1 UV section to the, to whatever direction you want. But essentially, okay, what's a better way to say this? When you bake a normal map, or any map for that matter, the baker only looks at the 0 to 1 UV space. It ignores everything outside of that. Now the problem is that if you have, say, a sphere that's cut in half, and both of those sphere halves are overlapping each other, and they're both sitting within the 0 to 1 space, when you go to bake, you're likely going to have an issue because the baker is going to bake both of those shells on top of each other. And depending, one of them might be rotated just a little bit differently, or it's flipped or whatever, and you end up with weird artifacts on the normal map, or a weird seam that runs around the mirror, and you can't figure out why. And the reason is because you're baking two shells on top of each other. Now that's part of the picture. The other part of the picture is that if you don't set this up correctly, what you end up with is the vertex normals that sit on the mirrored seam. If there's not geometry on both sides of that seam, and that geometry is not welded, then the vertex normals on that seam aren't correct, or they're, well, annoyingly, they're generally close, but they're not exactly correct, which means you will get a seam that runs down the mirror line. And when you're just getting started out, that is some of the most annoying problems, because you don't understand what's going on. And it's a math issue and all that kind of junk. But the way to solve both of those issues is what I'm doing right here. So I select the piece that's going to be mirrored. I mirror over the geometry. Then on the UV map, I move the mirrored pieces 1 UV over. That means that it still lines up with the normal map, and all the other maps I'm going to bake, and it's still going to, to look correct, but the baker is going to ignore the mirrored section and just work on the section that falls within the 0 to 1 space. God, that's a lot of information to throw at you at once, but I hope that makes some sense. I do plan to do a more detailed tutorial on this, but for now, take those general rules and apply them to anything you're trying to mirror, and you should be relatively happy. So you can see the process here with this piece. I mirror it, I move the UVs over by 1 unit, come back to the viewport, and weld down that center line. That gives me the ideal setup, because you see how that piece is kind of curved over the top? Those vertex normals need to be welded, or the normal map is not going to bake without a mirror line. And in the second part of this video, this is just me having mirrored all the geo the way I was talking about. I'm going through and I'm looking at it now and trying to make sure there's no mirror lines, no splooge happening between the two halves, anywhere. Because I might have missed a weld, I might have missed something. But this all looks pretty happy. If I remember correctly, this actually turns out okay. So the next step is I'm going to reassemble the gun. And I have the original file open, I think. Yeah, I do. So, I flip back and forth between the two because sometimes I'm not exactly sure where things go. Oh, one thing I didn't talk about is when I did when I moved all these pieces apart from each other, I did it in such a way that I think I used multiples of 5 centimeters whenever I move anything. So when I move it back, I just have to drag it roughly into place, then look at the transform property box over there, and just round off to the nearest value of 5, and it will snap back into place where it's supposed to be. It's just, it's obviously not necessary, but it's just the way I do it. And if something is exactly centered on the x-axis, I can just recenter it again. But the reason why I reassemble the mesh is I will take the assembled mesh and bring that into Substance Painter and use that assembled mesh to bake things like the ambient occlusion. That way the right pieces are occluding, like Substance Painter will use the normal map that I give it and the low poly geo to generate ambient occlusion. And a few other things too, I think, like thickness and whatever, but the ambient occlusion is the big one. And this gives me the most accurate ambient occlusion without having to export the high poly mesh, which I can't really do because I'm using the rounded edge shader, which means that my high poly mesh, I guess it would work okay in Painter with the hard edges on it, but it doesn't really give me much more of an advantage than just using the low poly. So anyway, that's just more of a preference thing. So, like I was saying, once we get this all reassembled, it's off to Substance Painter, and I'll see you over there. We're going to have some fun.